Somewhere above the Laotian panhandle, a little after midnight, an American aircraft drops toward a valley that most maps do not admit contains a road. There is a road. It was cut by hand and by bulldozer, widened across several seasons, patched after every strike, and roofed wherever possible with branches lashed to bamboo frames. From altitude, it reads as a suggestion rather than a line, a pale seam that shows where the canopy thins and vanishes again where it doesn't. Tonight, the aircraft is not going to crater it. A dispenser slung beneath the wing opens as the aircraft runs the target box. Nothing falls the way ordnance normally falls. Instead, the air behind the aircraft fills with small objects, thousands of them, tumbling and then catching the air and beginning to turn. Each one spins on the way down, unhurried, the way a maple seed comes off a branch in autumn. They don't drop, they settle. No flash, no shockwave rolling up the valley. The road below is exactly as wide, exactly as passable, exactly as intact as it was 90 seconds ago. A few of the objects come to rest on the packed surface. Most do not. They disappear into elephant grass, into the mud along the shoulder, into leaf litter under the trees, into ditch water, into the churned earth where a crater was filled last week. The aircraft turns for home. Whatever it just did here has not happened yet. That was the whole idea. A bomb announces exactly where it landed. This weapon was built to become part of the ground, to lie in the dirt of a supply route and wait. And in waiting, make every man who worked that route think twice about where he put his feet. American air power could break a road. What the men who designed this were reaching for was something harder. A way to make a road stay broken after the airplanes were gone. The objects were mines. One version was designated the Blue 43/B. Blue stood for Bomb Live Unit, the designation family the Air Force used for the air-delivered submunitions and dispersed ordnance that filled its cluster weapons. Almost nobody said that out loud. In the field and in the reports, it was the Dragontooth. Related mines in the same family, the Blue 44/B and the later Blue 44A/B, carried the same nickname and the same basic concept, and later accounts routinely blur them together. They should not be treated as one item. Detail and cluster hardware set them apart, and much of the confusion surrounding this weapon comes from writers and caption editors who never separated them. What they shared was the recipe. Small, plastic-bodied, almost no metal, scattered from the air in enormous quantities rather than buried one at a time by engineers. Built to injure a man on foot, not to kill a truck. And that is roughly where public memory of it ends. Consider how strange that is. Most Americans who followed this war can name the B-52 and the Phantom, napalm and the Daisy Cutter. The Dragontooth was dispersed across parts of the same interdiction zone in quantity, and left almost no trace in the popular history of Vietnam. Part of that is physical. A weapon the length of your thumb produces no gun camera footage worth keeping. Part of it is procedural. It traveled inside containers and arrived as a line in an expenditure table. Part of it is where it was used, over a country the United States was not officially fighting in. And part of it is mislabeling. Surviving examples turn up inert, broken, unmarked, or sitting beside a caption that names the wrong variant entirely. But the real reason this weapon existed has nothing to do with the mine. It has to do with a supply line that the most powerful air force on Earth could not shut off. Americans still talk about the Ho Chi Minh Trail as though it were a trail. It was closer to a highway system with no fixed geometry. Roads wide enough for Soviet trucks, footpaths worn by porters carrying rice on their backs, bicycle routes, river fords and ferry points, way stations a night's march apart, storage caches dug into hillsides, truck parks tucked under canopy, bypasses surveyed and cut in advance of the day they'd be needed. Most of it lay in eastern Laos, a great deal of it in Cambodia, all of it feeding men and cargo south into a war the North Vietnamese intended to sustain indefinitely. And it moved at night, in weather, under camouflage, by whatever means the section of route allowed. American air crews attacked it relentlessly. They cratered the roadbed, dropped the bridges, hit the fords, hunted the trucks with gunships and fighters, and, eventually, with some of the most sophisticated sensor technology anyone had ever fielded. On paper, the tonnage was staggering. The trail kept working. It kept working because destruction and denial are not the same thing. A crater is a hole, and a hole can be filled. A dropped span can be replaced with a ford, or a pontoon set at dusk and pulled out at dawn, or a bypass hacked around the gap over the course of a week. Road crews, many of them very young, worked those repairs continuously, in numbers Americans consistently underestimated. Bomb damage assessment, made through cloud and canopy from a fast-moving cockpit, was frequently a guess. Aircraft could destroy almost anything they could see. Seeing was the problem, and repairing was the answer the other side already had. So American planners went looking for a different kind of pressure, something that would not be undone by a shovel. The logic that emerged was straightforward, and it ran through the whole barrier and interdiction effort that culminated in the sensor-driven program known as Igloo White. If you cannot permanently remove a route, you can try to make the ground around it expensive. Slow the repair crew. Make the bypass survey dangerous. Force men to probe, to mark, to detour, to spend daylight hours in the open where aircraft could find them. Put a cost on every step off the pavement. None of this required a powerful weapon. It required a great many small ones, delivered fast, over ground nobody on the American side would ever walk. Which meant building a mine unlike anything an engineer had ever buried by hand. The Dragontooth came out of the mid-1960s push for air-delivered area denial munitions, an effort that ran through Air Force and Army development channels and drew directly on requirements coming out of Southeast Asia. It was one of several competing answers. The best known was Gravel, small fabric-cased mines sown by the thousand, and later the Army's wide-area anti-personnel mine system. All of them shared one ambition: minefields laid by airplane, in minutes, without a single American on the ground. The Dragontooth's answer was its shape. The body was molded plastic, roughly 3 inches long, asymmetric, with a flattened wing running off one side. That geometry wasn't styling. Released into the slipstream, the mine auto-rotated. It spun on its wing and came down slowly, the way a maple seed does, which meant it could be scattered without any parachute or retarder and arrive intact instead of shattering. The nickname followed from the profile, something small and hooked, half buried in the dirt. Dragon's tooth. It weighed almost nothing, and published figures vary between sources. Inside was a small quantity of liquid explosive, and the initiating system worked hydraulically. Pressure on the body did the work, with no battery and no electronics to fail. Colors ran to olive drab, tan, brown, and camouflage, and the bodies carried no markings of any kind. Every one of those choices was doing a job. The plastic body meant very little metal, and very little metal meant the mine did not answer a detector the way the steel-cased mines of Korea and the Second World War had. It was never undetectable. That word gets thrown around, and it is wrong. Trained personnel could and did find these. But finding them was slow, and slow was the point. The size meant numbers. 120 Blue 43/Bs loaded into a single CDU-2/B cluster adapter, and 40 of those adapters went into an SU-13/A dispenser to make up the CBU-28/A. That is roughly 4,800 mines under one wing station. The Blue 44/B used its own adapters and its own designated munition on the same principle. The dispenser mattered as much as the mine. The Su-13/A stayed attached to the aircraft and ejected its adapters in sequence as the airplane flew, so the mines were laid along a track rather than dumped in a heap. A pilot could paint a strip of contaminated ground across a valley floor at a few hundred knots. And the mine was not meant to last. Each carried a chemical self-neutralization system intended to render the explosive fill inert after a set period, so that a temporary obstacle stayed temporary. The Blue 43/B and Blue 44/B differed principally in how that sterilization was accomplished, and the later Blue 44A/B is described as a self-destruct version, with a nominal life measured in days rather than weeks. That feature was the most important claim in the entire program, and the one nobody could verify from a cockpit. How reliably a system built on chemistry and physical pressure performed in standing water, monsoon heat, and Laotian mud is poorly documented in anything available today. Which raises the question the whole concept rested on. Could a weapon whose effect came from uncertainty produce a result any commander could actually measure? The Dragontooth's war was mostly fought in Laos. It appears in the record alongside the sensor and strike architecture the Air Force built over the trail. The program that began as Muscle Shoals and became Igloo White in mid-1968. Air Force histories of that period describe active sensor strings being seeded with gravel munitions, Dragontooth mines, and wide-area anti-personnel mines for two reasons: to discourage enemy troops from locating and destroying the sensors, and to stop or funnel foot traffic into places where it could be detected and struck. Read that again because it reframes the weapon. The Dragontooth wasn't primarily there to kill infiltrators, it was there to protect the listening devices and to herd men into the open. The attraction was real. Aircraft could contaminate a stretch of ground in a single pass, over territory no American patrol would ever enter, and repeat it whenever traffic analysis suggested a route had come back to life. Repair parties would have to slow down. Porters would have to test their footing. Surveyors cutting a new bypass would have to work in more daylight. Then Southeast Asia went to work on the concept. The first problem was the ground. Mines scattered from altitude land where the terrain puts them, not where the plan puts them. Some settled in the open where they could be seen and marked. Others fell into water, mud, or vegetation that changed how they behaved, or whether they behaved at all. The second problem was climate, and here the record is blunt. Gravel, the anti-personnel half of the original barrier concept, is described in Air Force accounts as having failed outright, its mines deteriorating too quickly in the heat and humidity of Laos. By July 1968, official assessment was describing the barrier munitions as relatively ineffective, and sensors, not mines, were rapidly becoming the central product of Igloo White. The Dragontooth stayed useful around the sensor fields as a protective and disruptive device. It never delivered the sustained route denial the barrier concept had promised. The third problem was the enemy. As with every other form of interdiction, the North Vietnamese could mark suspected ground, avoid it, or push traffic onto redundant routes, and the network had been built around exactly that kind of adaptation. The fourth problem was arithmetic. Testimony to the Senate Armed Services Committee in this period described the weapon plainly: purely anti-personnel, capable of taking a man's foot off, unlikely to so much as flatten a truck tire, useful mainly as a deterrent against pulling up the larger anti-vehicle mines. A weapon that cannot stop a truck cannot stop a truck-based logistics system. Published totals for how many were built and how many were released differ considerably, partly because some sources combine several Dragontooth variants, and partly because production figures and confirmed operational expenditure are not the same number. Dispenser capacity tells you what an aircraft could carry. It tells you nothing about how many dispensers were actually expended, and no dependable total should be stated without an archival expenditure record. That leaves the harder question. If the United States could no longer account for where every one of those mines was, or confirm that everyone had gone quiet on schedule, what exactly was still out there when the mission ended? The Dragontooth's end was quiet and bureaucratic, which is how these things usually go. Production of the system ceased around 1970, and the expectation recorded at the time was that remaining stocks would be used up by the end of 1971. There was no scandal, no cancellation hearing, no dramatic reversal. The weapon simply ran out of reasons to exist. Several reasons converged at once, and none was secrecy. Its evaluated performance was mediocre, and the barrier concept that justified it was already being abandoned in favor of sensors and strike aircraft. American ground involvement was winding down. The Commando Hunt series that had provided the mine with its principal operational context ended in the spring of 1972, and the technology underneath it was aging fast. The Army and the Air Force were moving toward a new generation of scatterable mine systems, artillery and aircraft delivered, with more capable fusing and, critically, self-destruct behavior that was designed to be far more reliable than a hydraulic timer sitting in a Laotian ditch. That reliability question is the one worth sitting with. The Dragontooth self-neutralization was a genuine attempt at responsibility, a mine that turned itself off, so a temporary obstacle didn't become a permanent one. As a concept, it was sound. Confidence in its execution, under real conditions, across every item ever manufactured, was another matter. American landmine policy after Vietnam changed repeatedly, and never in one clean step. It shifted through export moratoria, through evolving Defense Department rules on self-destructing and self-deactivating mines, and through the United States' decision to remain outside the 1997 treaty that many of its allies signed. Those are distinct things, a matter of policy, a matter of doctrine, and a matter of treaty law, and they should not be collapsed into a claim that this particular mine was banned. It wasn't banned, it was superseded, and then it was gone from the inventory well before most of those debates began. The Dragontooth belonged to one narrow stage of one very specific problem. The moment when American engineers believed air power could be converted directly into a persistent obstacle on the ground. Withdrawing a weapon from service, though, does nothing whatsoever about the ones already in the dirt. What remains of the Dragontooth sits in two places. The first is museum cases and explosive ordnance reference collections, where inert examples and marked training versions survive alongside cutaway models. These are routinely misidentified online. Genuine wartime pieces, training mines, replicas, and photographs of the Soviet PFM-1 all circulate under the same captions. Assume a picture is wrong until its provenance is established. The PFM-1 deserves a careful sentence. That Soviet mine, the one that terrorized Afghanistan in the 1980s, is widely described as reverse-engineered from recovered American Dragontooths, and the resemblance in concept is unmistakable. Plastic body, liquid charge, auto-rotating descent, air delivery in bulk. It is also substantially larger and differs in construction. That copying claim is repeated almost universally and documented far less thoroughly than its repetition suggests. Call it a strong technological parallel, not proven lineage. The second place its legacy survives is in the contaminated ground of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Clearance organizations in Laos alone catalog more than 180 distinct munition types still being recovered. Laos has identified over 2,000 square kilometers as confirmed hazardous area and cleared under half of it, destroying more than 2 million items. Real progress against a problem that remains enormous. Wartime ordnance has caused tens of thousands of casualties in the region since 1964, with cluster submunitions accounting for a particularly large share of them in Laos. None of that toll belongs to the Dragontooth specifically, and whether any item recovered today is one is a question for clearance records. The principle it demonstrated is the principle that makes that work so slow. A weapon designed to vanish into the landscape vanishes on everyone's terms, including the terms of the people who put it there. If you ever encounter something in the ground that might be ordnance, do not touch it, do not move it, do not let anyone near it. Mark the spot and call the professionals. The Dragontooth's importance was never the size of a single blast. It was the idea that thousands of tiny, patient obstacles could shape the movement of an army. It was built to cost the enemy hours. What it cost has been measured in decades. If you want more forgotten American weapons, experimental Vietnam-era technology, and the battlefield inventions that history quietly buried, subscribe. There's a great deal more of this coming. And tell me where you land on this one. Was the Dragontooth an ingenious way to extend American air power down onto the ground? Or did the uncertainty it left behind outweigh whatever delay it bought? Leave a comment. I read them.